Summer when the days are long and the nights seem endless. But not every summer memory is filled with sunshine and laughter. Sometimes, the most terrifying experiences happen when the world is bathed in warm, golden light. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story that will make you think twice about those lazy summer nights. This is a true story, one that happened to someone just like you. So, turn off the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a tale you won't soon forget. Our story begins with a group of 5 friends: Emma, Josh, Sarah, Liam, and Rachel, who decided to spend a weekend camping at a remote site deep in the woods. It was the middle of July, and they were eager to escape the city heat for a few days of fun, surrounded by nature. They'd done this before every summer, in fact, but this year, something felt different. As they drove further away from civilization, the excitement in the car slowly gave way to an uneasy silence. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the signal on their phones disappeared completely. They finally reached the campsite just as the last rays of sunlight were fading, casting the forest in a dim, eerie glow. The first night was uneventful, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She chalked it up to nerves. After all, they were miles away from anyone else, in the middle of nowhere. But, as the night wore on, strange things started to happen. At first, Emma thought it was just an animal. But then the footsteps stopped right outside her tent. She held her breath, listening intently, and that's when she heard its soft whispering, just beyond the thin fabric. It wasn't in English, or any language she recognized. It was low, guttural, and sent a chill down her spine. Emma's heart was pounding as she unzipped the tent, inch by inch. She shined the flashlight outside, but there was nothing there, just the empty woods, silent and still. She convinced herself it was her imagination, but she couldn't sleep after that, and when she finally drifted off, it wasn't long before she was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. The scream didn't sound human. It was high-pitched, almost animalistic, and it seemed to come from all directions at once. They grabbed their flashlights and searched the area, but found nothing, no signs of animals, and no explanation for the sound. Shaken, they all agreed to stay close to the fire for the rest of the night. By morning, they were exhausted and on edge, but they decided to stay one more night. They didn't want to seem paranoid, and besides, they'd driven so far to get there. They spent the day hiking and swimming in a nearby lake, trying to enjoy themselves, but the unease lingered. As night fell, the forest seemed to come alive, with unsettling noises, branches snapping, rustling leaves, and that same strange whispering, just out of earshot. Emma was on edge, but it wasn't until she saw something moving in the trees that she realized they were being watched. They decided to leave first thing in the morning, but the forest had other plans. As they tried to sleep, the footsteps returned, this time louder and closer. The whispering grew more intense, like it was right outside their tents. And then, the screams started again, piercing through the night, sending them into a panic. They couldn't wait until morning. They had to get out of there. But as they scrambled to pack up, they realized with growing horror that the footsteps were circling them, faster and faster. The whispering was all around them, echoing off the trees, and the screams were so loud they could barely think. They barely made it to the car, and as they sped down the narrow dirt road, they could still hear the screams fading into the distance. They didn't stop driving until they were back in the city, their nerves shot and their hearts racing. They never spoke about what happened in those woods, not to each other, and not to anyone else. Emma still has nightmares about that trip. She doesn't know what was out there, and she doesn't want to know. But one thing is certain, something was in those woods, and it wasn't human. So, the next time you plan a camping trip in the middle of nowhere, remember this story. Because once you're out there, far from anyone who can help you, you might not be as alone as you think. Story number 2. Summer nights filled with laughter, campfires, and the feeling of freedom. But not every summer night is warm and inviting. Some nights are so terrifying that they leave a mark on your soul. Tonight, I'm going to share a true story that happened to someone just like you. A story of a seemingly innocent camping trip that turned into a nightmare. This is not for the faint of heart, so if you're ready, let's dive in. Our story begins with a group of friends: Tom, Lisa, Ben, and Emily, who were eager to escape the city for a weekend of camping. They'd found a secluded spot deep in the woods, a place so remote that it wasn't even on most maps. Perfect for getting away from it all, or so they thought. As they drove deeper into the woods, the road became rougher, the trees denser. The sun dipped below the horizon, and an uneasy feeling settled in the car. But they shrugged it off. This was exactly what they'd been looking for, an adventure away from civilization. The first night was uneventful. They laughed, told ghost stories, and enjoyed the solitude. But as the fire began to die down, so did their laughter. The silence of the woods seemed to press in on them, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Still, they were tired from the trip and soon retreated to their tents, falling asleep to the sounds of the forest. It was around 3 a.m. when Lisa awoke to a strange noise, something between a whisper and a hiss. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then she heard it again, closer this time. She sat up, straining to listen. The sound was coming from outside her tent, moving slowly around the campsite. She couldn't see anything, but the sound continued, circling the campsite. It was as if something or someone was walking just beyond the reach of their campfire's dying embers. She whispered to Tom, who was sleeping next to her, but he just mumbled and rolled over. Not wanting to seem paranoid, she lay back down, telling herself it was just an animal, even though it didn't sound like one. The next day passed without incident. They hiked, swam in a nearby lake, and explored the woods, trying to shake off the previous night's unease. But as the sun began to set, Lisa couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. She wasn't the only one. Emily, usually the most cheerful of the group, seemed unusually quiet. When pressed, she admitted she'd had a nightmare dream where something was watching them from the trees. That night, they went to bed early, hoping for a good night's sleep before they headed back home in the morning. But sleep wouldn't come easily. The forest was alive with noises: cracking branches, rustling leaves, and that strange hissing whisper. And then, just as they were about to drift off, they heard it, a low, guttural growl, followed by a heavy thud, as if something massive had landed in the clearing. None of them dared to move. They lay in their tents, paralyzed with fear, as the growling grew louder, closer. It circled their tents, heavy footsteps crunching the underbrush. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. They didn't speak as they packed up their gear. Whatever had been out there last night was gone, but the feeling of dread lingered. They piled into the car and drove out of the woods as fast as they could, not looking back until they were miles away. As they drove back to the city, they tried to make sense of what had happened, but there was no explanation that made sense. They were seasoned campers. They knew the sounds of the woods. But this was something different, something unnatural. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something truly evil. That night, as she lay in her bed, she realized something that sent a chill down her spine. Whatever it was that had circled their campsite, it hadn't just been passing by, it had been hunting them. They never went camping again, and they never spoke about that night. But sometimes, when the summer air is just right, Lisa swears she can still hear that low growl in the distance, like a reminder that some things are better left unexplored. Story number 3. Summer nights can be beautiful, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the warmth of a gentle breeze. But sometimes, the beauty of summer can mask something far more sinister. Tonight, I'm going to share with you a story that will make you question those quiet, peaceful nights. This is a true story, a terrifying encounter that left its mark on a small town and the people who lived there. So, get comfortable, if you can. This is the story of the shadow in the cornfield. Our story takes place in a quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and nothing ever seems to happen. But in the summer of 1985, something did happen, something that still haunts those who lived through it. It started on the Thompson farm, a sprawling property on the outskirts of town where the corn grew tall and thick, creating a natural maze that was easy to get lost in. John and Mary Thompson were hard-working farmers, raising their children, Danny and Lucy, on the land that had been in their family for generations. That summer was unusually hot, and the corn grew taller than ever, towering over even the tallest adults. The kids loved playing in the cornfield, making up games and chasing each other through the rows. But as the summer wore on, the cornfield became less of a playground and more of a place they avoided. Especially after dark, it started with Lucy, the younger of the two. One evening, as she was helping her mother hang laundry, she thought she saw something moving in the cornfield. At first, she brushed it off as her imagination, a trick of the light as the sun dipped below the horizon. But then she saw it again, a shadowy figure darting between the rows, too tall to be any of the local wildlife. John wasn't worried. The cornfield was their livelihood, and it had always been safe. But Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The next night, she refused to go near the cornfield, and Danny teased her for being scared. But when he saw the fear in his sister's eyes, he decided to prove that there was nothing to worry about. Danny walked deeper into the cornfield, the rows closing in around him. The air was thick with the smell of earth and vegetation, and the only sound was the rustling of the corn as the wind picked up. He called out to Lucy, laughing at how silly she was being. But then, the laughter died on his lips when he heard a low, shuffling sound, like something moving through the corn just ahead of him. Danny's heart began to race. He called out again, this time with a hint of fear in his voice. There was no answer, just that shuffling sound growing closer. He turned around, ready to head back to the house, but he realized with growing panic that he had lost his sense of direction. The corn was too tall, and everything looked the same. That's when he saw a shadow, taller than a man, moving silently through the rows, heading straight for him. Danny ran as fast as he could, the corn whipping against his face and arms. He could hear the footsteps behind him, heavy and deliberate, like something was stalking him. He screamed for help, but his voice was swallowed by the cornfield. Just when he thought he couldn't run any further, he burst out of the corn and into the open field, gasping for breath. He looked back, but the shadow was gone. The corn swayed gently in the wind, as if nothing had happened. His parents didn't believe him. They thought he'd let his imagination get the best of him, that he'd just scared himself silly. But Danny knew what he saw, and he refused to go near the cornfield after that. Lucy, too, stayed away, convinced that something was out there, lurking just beyond sight. Over the next few nights, strange things began to happen. The animals on the farm grew restless, refusing to go near the cornfield. John started to notice that parts of the crop were trampled, as if something heavy had moved through it. And then there were the whispers, soft, unintelligible, but unmistakably human, coming from the depths of the corn. John was a practical man, not one to believe in ghosts or monsters. He decided to put an end to the fear once and for all. Late one night, while his family slept, he grabbed a lantern and ventured into the cornfield. The rows seemed to close in around him as he walked, the light from the lantern barely piercing the darkness. He followed the trampled path, the whispers growing louder with each step. As he reached the heart of the cornfield, the whispers stopped. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay. And then he saw a figure, standing motionless among the stalks. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch into the darkness. Its face was obscured by shadows, but John could feel its eyes on him, cold and malevolent. John couldn't move. He could barely breathe. The figure stepped closer, and he felt a wave of terror unlike anything he'd ever known. He wanted to run, to scream, but he was paralyzed with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, melting into the shadows of the cornfield. The whispers stopped, and the cornfield was silent once more. John never spoke about what he saw that night. The next day, he and his family packed up and left the farm, abandoning it to the cornfield and whatever lay within it. The farm has remained empty ever since, the cornfield left to grow wild, and though the townspeople don't talk about it, everyone knows to stay away from the old Thompson farm, especially after dark. To this day, the farm remains untouched, slowly being reclaimed by nature. But on warm summer nights, when the wind is just right, some say you can still hear the whispers coming from the cornfield and see the shadowy figure moving through the rows. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting, watching. Thank you for joining me for tonight's story. If you've ever encountered something strange in the countryside, share your experience in the comments, and if this story gave you chills, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more eerie tales. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, some shadows are more than just tricks of the light.